Welcome to Urban American Stories. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. The heart monitor beeped irregularly as Michael Brown ran through the corridors of Mercy Hospital in Portland, Oregon. His hands were shaking as he typed a message to his wife, Claire, patient stable. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Little did he know that that night on call would be just the beginning of a life-changing battle in the quiet Pine Grove estate. His cell phone vibrated again. Michael, the contractions, something's wrong. The baby, it's only 32 weeks. Claire's message made his heart freeze. She immediately notified her supervisor, Patricia Martinez, about the family emergency and rushed to her 2019 Honda Civic parked in the employee area. During the 15-minute drive to Pine Grove, Michael tried to stay calm, but his thoughts oscillated between his wife in premature labor and the strict rules of the condominium, where they had lived for only 3 months. The HOA, presided over by the inflexible Richard Hawthorne, was known for its draconian attitude towards any deviation from the established rules. When he arrived home, there were no spaces available in his garage. The bricklayers hired to fix a leak had filled the space with building material. With no alternative and time running out, Michael parked briefly on the street in front of his house. Michael found his wife curled up on the sofa, breathing hard. "We're going to the hospital now." The couple had barely closed the door when a sharp voice pierced the night air. "Mr. Brown, parking on the street is expressly forbidden by HOA regulations." The voice belonged to Richard Hawthorne, a middle-aged man with thin-rimmed glasses in a military bearing. "It's an emergency, Richard. My wife is in premature labor," Michael replied, helping Claire into the car. "Rules are rules, Mr. Brown. Expect to receive formal notification of this infraction." Richard typed furiously on his tablet, photographing the evidence of the illegally parked car. For the next 36 hours, Michael remained by Claire's side at Portland Medical Center. The doctors managed to stop the premature labor, but Claire would need absolute rest for the next few months. It was only when he returned home to pick up some clothes that Michael discovered the true extent of the HOA's retaliation. A huge container of industrial waste was completely blocking his driveway. An official notice from the HOA was pinned to his door. Due to code violation 7.3.2, illegal parking, a fine of $5,000 has been imposed. The container will remain in place until the debt is paid in full. Michael tried to contact Richard, but his calls were systematically ignored. Frustrated, he removed the container enough to free up access to his garage. He couldn't afford to miss work, especially now with medical bills piling up. The next morning, he found another notice: vandalism of community property, additional fine of $5,000. Total due $10,000. "That's ridiculous," Michael confronted Richard during an impromptu meeting at the HOA office. "My wife was at risk of premature labor. What kind of person punishes someone for a medical emergency?" "The kind of person who respects rules, Mr. Brown." Richard adjusted his glasses with a cold smile. "If we start making exceptions, everyone will claim an emergency to park wherever they like. The container remains until the fines are paid in full." The news spread quickly through the Pine Grove community. Some neighbors, like the Martinez family, no relation to their hospital supervisor, and the Wilsons, expressed support for Michael, but most remained silent, fearing reprisals from the HOA. Jennifer Wilson, a retired attorney who lived 2 houses down, approached Michael as he tried again to remove the container. "What they're doing is illegal, Michael. They can't block your access to the property, let alone for a documented medical emergency." "I don't have the money to hire a lawyer right now, Jennifer. With the hospital expenses." Michael ran a hand over his tired face. "You don't have to," Jennifer smiled, her eyes shining with determination. "I still keep my active license. And nothing would give me more pleasure than to stand up to that tyra, Richard. He's done this to many families before, but no one has had the courage to challenge him." That night, Michael sat beside Claire's hospital bed, holding her hand as she slept. His phone vibrated with a message from Jennifer. "I prepared the initial paperwork. We're suing the HOA for harassment, obstruction of property, and moral damages. First hearing scheduled for Monday." Looking at his sleeping wife and thinking of the baby she was struggling to keep safe in her womb, Michael felt a determination grow inside him. This wasn't just a fight for his right to access his own home, it was a battle against the tyranny that had haunted Pine Grove for so long. And with Jennifer's unexpected help, perhaps someone would finally be able to put an end to Richard Hawthorne's reign of terror. The courtroom of the Portland District Court was silent as Jennifer Wilson arranged her documents on the defense table. Michael, still wearing his paramedic's uniform after a 12-hour shift, nervously adjusted his tie. Across the hall, Richard Hawthorne and his corporate lawyer Maxwell Stewart were talking in confident whispers. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Catherine Reynolds," announced the bailiff. Judge Reynolds, a woman in her 60s with gray hair and piercing eyes, studied the room for a few moments before speaking. Case number 2023 CV 4872, Michael Brown versus Pine Grove Homeowners Association. "You may be seated." Jennifer rose first. "Your Honor, this is an egregious case of abuse of power and retaliation. My client, a paramedic dedicated to saving lives, has been punished for responding to a medical emergency involving his at-risk pregnant wife." Maxwell Stewart interrupted. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the HOA rules are clear and were accepted by Mr. Brown when he signed the purchase agreement. Emergency or not, rules exist for a reason." Judge Reynolds removed her glasses. "Mr. Stewart, are you suggesting that parking regulations override medical emergencies?" "We're suggesting that making exceptions sets dangerous precedents," Stewart replied, adjusting his silk tie. Jennifer projected photos of the container blocking the entrance to Michael's garage. "Your Honor, the HOA has not only levied abusive fines, but is also physically impeding my client's access to his property. A paramedic who needs to respond to emergency calls is being prevented from doing his job." As the hearing continued, Michael received a message from his neighbor Maria Martinez. "Michael, you need to see this. Richard is removing the container, but he's doing something worse." During the break in the hearing, Michael watched the video sent by Maria. Richard was supervising a team installing concrete pylons around the entire entrance to his garage. "Temporary security measure," Richard said in the video, "until the case is resolved." Jennifer looked at the video with indignation. "That's perfect, Michael. He's just given us more ammunition." Back in the courtroom, Jennifer presented the recent video. "Your Honor, while we're here, the HOA is escalating its intimidation tactics." Judge Reynolds watched the video with a stern expression. "Mr. Stewart, your explanation?" "The HOA has the authority to implement security measures as necessary," Stewart replied less confidently than before. "Security measures?" Jennifer questioned. "Or retaliation against a resident who dared to question Mr. Hawthorne's authority." The tension in the room increased when Jennifer called her first witness, Patricia Martinez, Michael's supervisor at the hospital. "Ms. Martinez, can you describe Mr. Brown's professional character?" "Michael is one of our best paramedics," Patricia replied. "On the night in question, he had just stabilized a patient in cardiac arrest when he received the message from his wife." "And what would be the impact of having your access to the garage blocked in emergency situations?" "In our profession, minutes make the difference between life and death," Patricia explained. "Preventing a paramedic from responding to calls is potentially catastrophic." Stewart tried to discredit the testimony. "Ms. Martinez, is there any legal requirement for the HOA to make exceptions for emergency professionals?" "There is no legal requirement to be compassionate either, Mr. Stewart," Patricia replied, prompting murmurs in the gallery. Jennifer then presented a pattern. In the last 5 years, Richard had imposed fines totaling more than $300,000, often for minor infractions. Several residents had been forced to sell their homes due to debts accumulated with the HOA. "Your Honor," Jennifer concluded, "we are faced with a system designed not to maintain order, but to generate revenue through intimidation. Mr. Brown is just the latest victim of a pattern of abuse of power." Judge Reynolds removed her glasses again, a gesture that the room had already learned to recognize as a prelude to an important decision. "Mr. Stewart, your client has 24 hours to remove all obstructions from Mr. Brown's property. In addition, all fines related to the incident are temporarily suspended until the conclusion of this process." Michael felt a weight being lifted from his shoulders, but the victory was only partial. Richard Hawthorne left the room with a smile that suggested the battle was far from over. "Don't celebrate yet," Jennifer warned, putting her papers away. "Richard isn't known for accepting defeat easily. And we still have to prove the pattern of harassment to achieve systemic change in the HOA's administration." On his way to the hospital to visit Claire, Michael reflected on how a simple family emergency had turned into a crusade against institutional injustice. His phone rang. It was Maria Martinez again. "Michael, you need to come home now." Her voice was tense. "Richard has called an emergency HOA meeting. They're voting on new security measures that coincidentally especially affect your property." Jennifer, who was still standing next to him in the courthouse parking lot, overheard the conversation. "Go to the hospital, Michael. We'll take care of it. It's time to show Mr. Hawthorne that two people can play this game." The Pine Grove community room was buzzing with altered voices when Jennifer Wilson walked through the double doors carrying a briefcase full of documents. The air conditioning barely kept out the heat generated by dozens of agitated residents hastily gathered for the extraordinary meeting called by Richard Hawthorne. Single agenda item. Richard announced from the makeshift pulpit, his glasses reflecting the fluorescent lights. A vote to implement new security measures including electronic gates at all garage entrances and targeted surveillance cameras. Jennifer raised her hand. "Before the vote, I would like to present evidence that these security measures constitute targeted harassment." "Ms. Wilson, you don't have a vote in this assembly," Richard cut in, his cold smile barely concealing his irritation. "You only represent Mr. Brown as a lawyer." "Actually," Jennifer smiled, removing a document from her briefcase. "As the owner of Unit 247 for 20 years, I have every right to question proposals that violate not only our bylaws, but also federal laws." A murmur went through the room. Richard paled slightly, but kept his composure. "Go ahead, then." Jennifer projected a series of emails onto the main screen, correspondence between Richard and Maxwell Stewart dating back to before the incident with Michael. These messages prove that the installation of surveillance equipment was already planned, specifically targeting residents who questioned the authority of the current administration. Maria Martinez, sitting in the front row, stood up. "As chair of the security committee, I was never consulted about these plans. This violates Article 12 of our bylaws. The situation with Mr. Brown only proves that stricter measures are needed." Richard tried to argue, but his voice faltered as Jennifer projected more documents. "Financial records show that 60% of the HOA's revenue over the past 5 years has come from fines," Jennifer continued. "Interestingly, properties owned by close friends of Mr. Hawthorne never even receive a notice despite documented violations." At the hospital, Michael held Claire's hand as he followed the meeting via video call on his tablet. "I can't believe Jennifer got all these documents so quickly," Claire whispered, stroking her protruding belly. "Apparently she's been collecting evidence for years," Michael replied. "She was just waiting for the right moment to use it." Back in the assembly, Jennifer presented her final card. "And speaking of violations, I discovered something interesting about Mr. Hawthorne's own house." She projected architectural plans side by side. On the left, the plan approved by the town hall. On the right, aerial photos showing an unauthorized extension that encroaches on a conservation area. Chaos ensued in the room. Richard tried to close the meeting, but Jennifer continued. "I propose a different vote, a complete audit of the current management, and early elections for a new board." "That's a coup," Richard shouted. "It has no legal basis." Article 8, Paragraph 3 of the bylaws, Jennifer quoted from memory. "Any owner can propose an audit vote on presentation of evidence of mismanagement." "I have here," she held up a folder, more than 50 pages of evidence. The vote was quick and overwhelming. With 82% of the vote, the audit was approved, and an interim board would be set up until new elections. Richard left the room in silence, followed by his small group of allies. The next day, Michael found his entrance completely cleared when he arrived home from work. A group of neighbors led by Maria Martinez had voluntarily removed the pylons during the early hours of the morning. "Consider it a community apology," Maria smiled, offering a welcome basket. It took a while, but finally someone had the courage to stand up to Richard. Jennifer appeared shortly afterwards carrying more documents. "The audit has already begun. We found enough irregularities for a criminal prosecution for embezzlement." Richard diverted more than $100,000 in fines into a personal account. "How did you get all this information?" Michael asked in amazement. 20 years of silent observation and many contacts in the forum." Jennifer winked. "But we needed the perfect case to expose everything. A dedicated paramedic, a pregnant wife, at risk disproportionate retaliation." Richard finally chose the wrong victim. That afternoon, as Michael organized his now vacant garage, he noticed Richard loading boxes into his car. The former HOA president had listed his house for sale that morning. It didn't have to end like this, Michael commented, approaching the wall that separated their properties. Richard paused, holding a box. For a moment it looked like he was going to ignore Michael, but then he said, "You know, it's ironic I started the HOA because I wanted to protect the value of our properties. At some point a power went to my head." "There's still time to do the right thing," Michael suggested. "Collaborate with the audit, return the money." "It's too late for that," Richard interrupted, putting the last box in the car. "But maybe it's not too late for you to learn from my mistakes when you take your place on the new board." Michael frowned. "What do you mean?" "I hear they're planning to appoint you to the interim board." Richard gave a tired smile. "Just don't let power change who you are." With those words, Richard got into his car and drove off, leaving Michael standing thoughtfully in the middle of his newly cleared driveway. His phone vibrated. It was Claire. "The doctors say I can be discharged tomorrow," she announced cheerfully. "The baby is stable and rest can be done at home." Michael smiled, looking at the now cleared entrance to his house. The battle with the HOA had been won, but a new challenge lay ahead: how to help rebuild a community torn apart by years of authoritarianism and fear. "Jennifer," he called his lawyer and now friend, "about this interim board thing. I think we need to talk." The sun had barely risen when Michael found a brown envelope in his mailbox. Inside, documents revealed that Richard Hawthorne had been president of 3 other HOAs in different states, all with similar histories of abusive fines and residents forced to move. Jennifer had dug deep into the former president's past. "It's a systematic pattern," Jennifer explained over an impromptu breakfast at the Browns' house, where Claire was finally resting after returning from the hospital. "Richard is like a vulture of planned communities. He finds stable HOAs, takes control, and turns them into money-making machines." Maria Martinez, who now chaired the interim board, flipped through the documents with a worried expression. "Some residents still defend Richard. They believe he kept order and property values high." "Fear is not order," Michael replied, adjusting the fetal monitor of Claire, who was asleep on the sofa. "And property values mean nothing if people live in terror." Jennifer's phone rang. It was Maxwell Stewart, Richard's former lawyer. "Wilson, we need to talk. I have some information you need to see." The meeting was arranged at Jennifer's office in downtown Portland. Maxwell looked nervous, constantly adjusting his silk tie as he rummaged through his briefcase. "Richard came to see me last night," Maxwell began, placing a flash drive on the table. "He wanted me to wipe some files from the HOA server, but I've already destroyed enough evidence to last a lifetime." Jennifer plugged the flash drive into her computer. On the screen, dozens of spreadsheets detailed an elaborate scheme. Richard was not only embezzling money from fines, but also receiving kickbacks from construction and maintenance companies that overbilled for services to the community. "Why are you helping us now?" Michael asked suspiciously. Maxwell smiled sadly. "Because Richard was planning to use me as a scapegoat. I found forged documents with my signature authorizing transfers that I've never seen." Meanwhile, in Pine Grove, a silent revolution was taking shape. Maria organized the first truly democratic HOA meeting in years. Residents shared stories of intimidation and retaliation, many discovering that they were not alone in their experiences. "My daughter had to sell her house after Richard fined her $20,000 for planting a garden without a permit." An elderly woman named Dorothy shared, tears in her eyes. She was a widow, raising 3 children on her own. Other similar reports emerged: fines for excessive Christmas decorations, threats for cutting grass half a centimeter longer than allowed, arbitrary bans on children playing in communal areas. "We can't just change the administration," Michael argued during the meeting. "We need to change the culture of fear that has taken hold here." Jennifer, who was following everything, had an idea. "What if we turn Pine Grove into a model of how an HOA should work, something that other communities could follow?" The proposal quickly gained momentum. A committee was formed to rewrite the bylaws, focusing on clarity and reasonableness. Another group started a conflict mediation program, replacing automatic fines with dialogue and constructive solutions. Michael, initially reluctant to participate in the administration, naturally found himself taking on a bridging role between different groups. His experience as a paramedic had taught him to stay calm in crises and look for practical solutions. "You have a natural gift for this," Claire commented one evening, watching him review proposals from residents. You can see beyond the rules and see the people. Pine Grove's transformation did not go unnoticed. Local newspapers began covering the story, presenting it as an example of how communities can recover from toxic administrations. Other HOAs in the region began asking for guidance on how to implement similar changes. But it wasn't all flowers. A group of residents loyal to Richard, led by former Treasurer Gregory Palmer, resisted the changes. They spread rumors about falling property values and rising crime, trying to sow fear and discord. "We can't ignore them," Jennifer warned during a strategy meeting. That's how Richard got power in the first place, by preying on people's fears. The solution came from an unexpected source. Patricia Martinez, Michael's supervisor at the hospital, offered to conduct workshops on crisis management and effective communication for the residents. If it worked for keeping medical teams together in emergencies, she argued, it can work for a community too. The workshops became a surprising success, not only improving communication between neighbors, but also creating safe spaces for old grievances to be addressed and resolved. Gradually, even Richard's staunchest supporters began to take part. Gregory Palmer, after attending a few sessions, publicly admitted to having benefited from the overbilling scheme and offered to cooperate with the investigations. "Sometimes people just need an honorable way out," Jennifer commented, watching Gregory voluntarily leave his position on the council. As Pine Grove transformed, Michael regularly received messages from residents of other communities asking for advice on how to deal with similar situations. With Jennifer's help, he began compiling a practical manual on reforming troubled HOAs. "You know what's ironic?" Michael reflected during an evening walk with Claire, their baby now safe and healthy in the womb. Richard wanted to control everything so badly that he ended up losing all control. And we, seeking to share power, are building something much stronger. The sun was setting over Pine Grove, and for the first time in years, people left their doors open on warm summer evenings. Children played freely in the gardens, and neighbors chatted without fear of fines or retaliation. The community was finally living up to its name. Fall arrived in Portland with a gentle breeze that stirred the golden leaves in Pine Grove. 6 months had passed since the fall of Richard Hawthorne, and the community breathed a different air, not just because of the change of season, but because of the profound transformation in its social structure. Michael adjusted the small cap on the head of his newborn daughter Emma as he walked through the condominium towards the community center. The place, once a symbol of oppression and fear, was now buzzing with positive activity. A banner at the entrance announced First Regional Forum on Community Governance. "I never imagined we'd be organizing something like this," commented Claire, pushing the baby carriage. "Let alone that people would come from other states to learn from us." The hall was packed. Representatives from more than 30 HOAs from all over the West Coast had gathered to discuss reforms and share experiences. Jennifer Wilson, now a recognized expert in homeowners association reform, was preparing to open the event. "The Pine Grove case is not unique," Jennifer began, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "In the last few weeks, we've received more than 200 reports of communities facing similar situations. The difference is that we now have a model for change that works." Michael watched the audience as Jennifer presented the impressive figures of the transformation: resident complaints reduced by 85%, property values increased by 12% in the last quarter, and most significantly, the resident move-out rate dropped to less than 3% per year. "But we're not here to just talk numbers," Michael took over the microphone. "We're here to discuss how to transform our HOAs from instruments of control into tools of community building." The day unfolded with practical workshops and panel discussions. Maria Martinez led a session on transparent communication, using Pine Grove's new digital system as an example. Patricia shared conflict resolution techniques adapted from her hospital experience. During lunch, Michael was approached by a young resident of an HOA in Seattle. "How did you deal with the resistance?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Our president acts exactly like Richard, and I'm afraid I'll lose my house if I speak out." "Fear is the favorite tool of tyrants," Michael replied gently. "But communities are stronger than individuals. The key is to build alliances, document everything, and above all, don't let fear paralyze action." Jennifer, who had overheard the conversation, added, "And you're not alone. We're setting up a legal support network for communities in a similar situation. In the afternoon, during a panel on statutory reforms, news quickly circulated around the room. Richard Hawthorne had been arrested in Arizona, trying to replicate his scheme in a new community. Evidence provided by Maxwell Stewart had alerted authorities in several states. It's not about revenge, Michael pointed out as some attendees began to celebrate. It's about prevention and systemic change. The most poignant moment of the day came when Dorothy, the lady who had lost her daughter to Richard's abusive policies, announced the creation of an assistance fund for families threatened by predatory HOAs. "My daughter couldn't save her home," she said, moved, "but her sacrifice will not be in vain. This fund will help other families fight for their rights." At the end of the day, while the participants were exchanging contacts and making plans to implement changes in their own communities, Michael found a letter in his temporary office. It was from Richard Hawthorne. "Maybe you're right," the letter said. "Power without purpose corrupts, and I lost my purpose a long time ago. What you have built in Pine Grove is what I should have sought from the beginning." Michael shared the letter with Jennifer and Claire over dinner on their balcony, where a small community garden was now flourishing, something that would have been unthinkable in Richard's day. "You know what I'm most proud of," Claire commented, cradling Emma. "It's not just a change in rules or administration. It's seeing how people are smiling again, talking on the sidewalks, caring about each other." Jennifer smiled, watching children playing freely in the community garden, another project born out of the new management. Pine Grove has become a beacon of hope. Other communities are realizing that there is an alternative to authoritarianism. That evening after the forum, Michael updated the manual he was writing. From Fear to Community, a guide to reforming HOAs, already had interest from 3 publishers. But more important than the book were the people it represented, the stories of struggle, resistance, and ultimately transformation. "The true test of a community," Michael wrote in the epilogue, "is not its ability to enforce rules, but its ability to nurture human connections. In Pine Grove, we learn that strength comes not from control, but from cooperation. And that's a lesson worth more than any regulation." Emma let out a small cry from her crib, and Michael paused in his writing. As he cradled his daughter, he looked out of the window at the soft lights of Pine Grove. The houses were no longer isolated fortresses, but part of a living, pulsating social fabric. Pine Grove's legacy would continue far beyond that, fall not just in the pages of a book or in rewritten bylaws, but in the renewed spirit of a community that had found its voice in its heart. And that, Michael knew, was something no authoritarian HOA could ever destroy.